The bodies lay against the inside of the palisade, piled up in a ragged heap, like carcasses piled up after a successful hunt. Some were skinless on their faces and hands, as if someone had carefully removed it with a knife, leaving only red meat and white knuckles. Waistcoats and cloaks lay side by side, cut along the seams, as if they had been removed slowly and with a specific purpose. The tracks around the courtyard revealed a strange picture. The prints resembled those of a large animal, but some of them were positioned as if the animal were moving on its hind legs. The ground near the gate was compacted with many such tracks, and the depth of each one indicated the weight of a creature no less than an adult wolf. It is with this scene that the last page of the manuscript found during excavations of the foundations of the fort on Roanoke Island ends in 1998. A lead cylinder, about the length of a grown man's palm, lay beneath the roots of an old oak tree that grew just beyond the northern line of the palisade. The tree was significantly older than the colony itself, and growth rings examined by dendrologists indicate an age of more than 4 centuries. The archaeologists carefully removed the cylinder as the lead had become coated with a thick layer of oxide. Inside was a rolled-up scroll of wax-soaked paper wrapped in a piece of old canvas. The official report on the discovery was almost immediately seized by representatives of the Smithsonian Institution. The document was sent to a closed archive, where materials deemed undesirable for publication are usually stored. A copy of the text came into my possession through an employee of the Paper Conservation Laboratory who was working on the restoration of the manuscript. The main part of the text was written by the hand of Governor John White, the head of the English colony founded on Roanoke Island in 1587. However, the final pages are written by someone else. The handwriting becomes sharper, the letters are elongated, the lines tremble, as if the author wrote in dim light or with an injured hand. The diary itself doesn't begin with the settlement's initial difficulties or with a description of the fort's construction. It begins with the governor's return after a long absence. John White left the colony in the late summer of 1587. He sailed across the ocean to England to bring supplies and reinforcements. Political events and the war with Spain delayed him for almost 3 years. Only in the late summer of 1590 was the ship able to approach the island's shores again. In his diary, he describes how he expected to see signal fires, or at least smoke, over the settlement. However, the shore greeted him with complete silence. The boat carrying the sailors approached the old pier, where fishing nets had once been moored and reindeer skins had been hung to dry. None of that was there anymore. The water lapped against the piles, and the wind blew strips of dry grass along the shore. White records that he ordered his men to march toward the fort with loaded arquebuses. He feared an Indian attack or signs of a massacre, but the first few minutes of inspection revealed a strange sight. The wooden palisade stood intact. The gates stood wide open, as if they'd been thrown open and never closed again. In the courtyard stood houses made of pine logs with thatched roofs. The doors weren't broken, the windows weren't shattered. An iron cauldron hung on one of the fireplaces, containing deer bones. The meat had long since rotted, but the bones remained dry and brittle. There were clay mugs on the tables in the houses, and some had wooden spoons on them, as if people were about to continue their dinner and had simply stepped outside for a minute. White describes going through all the buildings with several sailors. They inspected the gunpowder storehouse, the grain barn, and the small chapel where the colonists gathered for prayer. They found no bodies. There were no arrows or signs of an assault. The powder kegs stood dry in the corner of the warehouse. The sacks of grain lay neatly stacked, though most of the supplies had already been consumed. From this, White concludes that the men could have abandoned the fort voluntarily. But he is perplexed by the lack of weapons and tools. Not a single musket or axe was found. After several hours of fruitless searching, the governor approached the northern side of the palisade. An old oak tree grew there, which the colonists had left behind when they built the fortification. It was on its trunk that the inscription was carved. The letters were carved deep into the wood with a knife and arranged in a neat line at chest height. The word consisted of 8 letters and denoted the name of a neighboring tribe. White writes that he initially perceived the inscription as a directional sign. He assumed the colonists had retreated to an island inhabited by Native Americans, with whom they maintained peaceful relations. However, while examining the tree, he noticed a strange detail. The soil around the roots had recently been dug up. The resulting layer of soil was a different color and density from the surrounding soil. The sailors dug into the earth and discovered a lead cylinder that White had buried before sailing to preserve records of the colony in case of disaster. The cylinder had been opened and then resealed. When it was opened, the governor's diary was inside. Most of the pages were written in White's familiar handwriting. However, toward the end, the text changed dramatically. The lines became uneven, the ink darkened, and some letters were written so deeply that the pen tore through the paper. White wrote that he recognized his own diary, but did not recognize the author of the final entries. He noted that someone continued keeping the journal after his departure. The last line, written in the governor's hand, contained a request to whoever remained alive. He wrote that if these notes reached people in England, whoever survived the rest should explain the fate of the colony. Immediately after this line, another person's text begins. The handwriting is so different that it's impossible to mistake it for the same hand. The letters are elongated, and the ink has run in places, as if the author wrote in the dark or on a damp surface. The first sentence left by this unknown person is short and pressed into the paper so hard that pen marks appear on the back of the sheet. It states that the colonists did not join a neighboring tribe or abandon the island. It then clarifies that the word carved into the tree did not refer to a destination. The author writes that this is the name of what came from the forest, and that by the time he began writing these lines, most of the people in the fort were already dead. The next line ends with the words that the first winter on the island passed quietly, only during the daytime, and the real events began every night, when sounds were heard from the dark forest, which at first were taken for the howling of wolves, but later it became clear that it was something else, because these voices uttered human words. And it was after one of these nights that the first lookout at the northern gate disappeared. I carefully examined the diary pages written after Governor John White's departure. The author's handwriting changes almost immediately, but the content of the text remains strict and consistent, as if the person was consciously keeping track of what was happening inside the colony. The entries begin with a description of the first winter on Roanoke Island. It turned out to be colder than the settlers expected. It was one night, a few weeks after Christmas, a guard on the North Tower reported hearing a baby crying outside the palisade. At first, it was dismissed as a simple illusion. In winter, the wind often passes through pine branches in such a way that a sound resembling the human voice is created. However, a few minutes later, the crying repeated itself, and this time it was heard by several people on the wall. The sound came from the forest, approximately 50 paces from the gate. It stopped. The colonists climbed the tower and peered into the darkness, but nothing was visible beyond the tree line. The moon illuminated only the edge of the clearing and the damp earth between the pine roots. The crying continued for about a minute, after which words were added. The voice belonged to a woman. He spoke in English and asked for help, claiming that there was a child in the forest who was freezing. The diary's author notes that the words sounded strangely calm, almost without emotion, as if the speaker was simply reproducing phrases without understanding their meaning. Three armed men climbed down behind the wall and walked toward the trees. They had gone about 30 steps from the fort when the crying suddenly shifted further into the forest. The sound did not fade. On the contrary, it maintained the same volume, as if the source of the voice were retreating along with the people. The men walked a few more steps, but the distance between them and the invisible speaker remained unchanged. After a while, the crying stopped as suddenly as if it had been cut off. They found no traces on the damp ground and soon returned to the fort. The following night, the phenomenon repeated itself, but in a different form. First, a child's cry was heard again, and then a male voice came from the forest, calling one of the settlers by name. The He had to be restrained by force because the voice kept repeating the name, each time changing the intonation slightly, as if the speaker was trying to find the right tone. After this incident, night guards were strengthened. 2 men were permanently stationed on the tower, and several more men with loaded arquebuses were stationed at the gate. However, the screams continued almost every night. Sometimes it was a woman's voice, sometimes a man's, sometimes a baby crying again. All these sounds had one thing in common. They spoke English without the slightest accent, even though there wasn't a single European settlement for miles around the colony. Over time, people began to notice another pattern. Voices from the forest often repeated the words previously heard inside the fort. One of the hunters told his neighbors that evening about his dead son, who had drowned while crossing the ocean. At night, the words were spoken exactly as the father himself had spoken them at the table. The diary's author emphasizes that the snow around the walls remained untouched that night. Not a single animal approached the fortification. However, the voice sounded as if the speaker was standing just a few steps from the gate. Despite the alarm, the colony continued to live its normal life. During the day, people worked, repairing roofs, drying meat, and setting snares for animals. The nighttime cries gradually began to be perceived as a strange phenomenon that posed no immediate threat. He took up his guard duty closer to midnight and stood at the inner side of the palisade, while the second guard watched the edge of the forest from the top platform of the tower. For a moment, the guard on the tower saw the man standing at the gate take a few steps toward the wall, as if trying to hear the words better. After that, the guard stopped responding to the signals. When the men descended, the guard's station was empty. His musket lay on the ground by the wall, and beyond the palisade, tracks began to trail through the soft snow, leading off into the dark forest. The diary's author notes that these tracks did not resemble human ones. They were too long and arranged in pairs, like the prints of the hind legs of a large animal that was moving straight towards the trees. The following diary entries begin immediately after the disappearance of sentry Thomas Embry. The author writes that the search began immediately after it became clear the sentry had not returned to his post. Several men emerged from the gates with torches and arquebuses, guided by footprints in the snow. The footprints did indeed look strange. They walked in a nearly straight line toward the forest and had a long stride, as if the creature were taking long leaps or very long strides. There were no visible paw prints nearby. The animal appeared to be moving only on its hind legs. The group followed the trail for about 100 steps, after which it suddenly disappeared into a patch of bare ground beneath the pine trees. Further on, the surface was covered with fallen needles, and it became impossible to determine the direction of movement. The men circled the nearby trees several times, but found no signs of a struggle or blood, so they soon returned to the fort. The next 2 days passed without further incident. The night screams from the forest did not stop, but no one else disappeared. The colonists began to discuss the possibility of an attack by an unknown predator, but most believed that Thomas Embry could have simply gotten lost in the darkness and died in the swamp. The diary's author notes that the mood in the settlement remained tense, but not yet panicked. People increased their guards and tried not to venture outside the walls after dark. On the third night after the lookout's disappearance, an event occurred that completely changed the colonists' attitude toward the situation. Around midnight, the guard on the tower spotted a figure at the northern gate. The man stood on the other side of the fence, motionless. The torchlight allowed only a general outline to be discerned. The diary's author writes that the figure was hunched over and held its head down, as if it were very tired or wounded. When the guards called out to it, the figure did not respond. Then one of the men on the wall recognized the doublet of Thomas Embry by its clothing. It was decided that the missing lookout had somehow managed to escape the forest and return to the fort. However, the man at the gate was behaving strangely. He stood motionless and swayed slightly, as if trying to balance on uneven ground. The diary's author notes that his arms hung too low, almost touching his knees. When one of the colonists asked him for the password, the figure remained silent. She only slowly raised her head, but even from the tower, it was difficult to make out her face in the darkness. For a few minutes, the people hesitated, not daring to open the gates. Finally, one of the older colonists decided that leaving his man outside in the cold would be too cruel and ordered him to be let inside. The heavy gate doors opened and two men came out to meet the returning sentry. As soon as they were within a few steps, one of them noticed that Embry's gait seemed off. The knees were bent at an unusual angle, and the back was arched, as if the spine had lost its natural shape. When the man was brought closer to the torchlight, it became clear that his face was almost completely covered in blood. His vest was also soaked in the dark liquid, which had dried and darkened. At that moment, one of the colonists reached out to support Embry's shoulder. The diary's author writes that what followed was a movement that could not be mistaken for human behavior. The figure straightened up abruptly, and the fabric of the doublet on the back split at the seams, revealing a long, narrow chest covered in short grey fur. The head turned too quickly, almost jerkily, and in the firelight it became clear that the face they had taken for Embry's was hanging unnaturally loosely on the skull, as if a piece of skin had simply been stretched over another head. The man standing closest only had time to scream before the creature struck him with its long arm. The blow was so powerful that the man fell to the ground, and the skin from the creature's face slid to the side, revealing an elongated muzzle with a narrow mouth and long teeth. At that moment, the colonists realized that they had not let a human into the fort. The diary's author describes the subsequent events of that night with the utmost precision, as if trying to leave the most detailed testimony possible for those who might one day find these notes. When the creature straightened up and the skin of Thomas Embry's face slid off his head, it became clear that what stood before the people was neither a man nor a known beast. The skull was elongated forward, like that of a large dog, but the jaw moved differently. The upper lip rose too high, revealing long teeth, and the lower jaw opened almost to chest level. The eyes were located closer to the front of the muzzle and reflected the light of the torches with a greenish gleam. The entire upper body was covered with short grey fur, but on the shoulders and neck hung pieces of human skin, which the creature apparently had just been wearing as a mask. The first blow landed on a man who tried to support the returning sentry. The creature's long arm struck him in the chest with such force that the man fell backward and immediately stopped moving. The second colonist tried to raise his arquebus, but the beast was faster. It made a short leap forward, grabbed the man by the shoulder, and threw him to the ground. The diary's author writes that the creature's movements were distinguished by a strange economy of effort. It acted quietly and precisely, without growling or wasted movements, as if it knew in advance exactly where to strike. One of the guards on the wall fired at point-blank range. The gunpowder flashed brightly, and the bullets struck the creature in the side. The blow threw him back a few steps, but instead of falling, the creature spun sharply and covered the distance to the gate in a single leap. At that moment, panic set in. Several people rushed to close the gates, while the rest fired down from the wall. The creature moved faster than any human. It rested on its hind legs, but when accelerating, it sometimes touched the ground with its long forelimbs, which ended in fingers with curved claws. One of these claws left a deep, almost palm-length gouge on the gate. Despite the bullet wound, the beast continued moving at its previous speed. He grabbed the second wounded colonist and ripped his throat out with one movement, then released the body and pushed off sharply. The next detail in the recording is especially important. The author indicates the height of the palisade that surrounded the fort. The wall was built of thick pine logs and reached approximately 5 times the height of a man. No human could have climbed over it without a ladder. However, the creature didn't even attempt to climb. It took a short run and literally flew over the edge of the wall. The guards on the tower saw his body hang in the air for a moment and then disappear behind the outer side of the fortification. When the men ran to the wall and looked down, nothing was visible in the darkness except the swaying branches of the pine trees. After that, the fort fell into an uneasy silence. 3 bodies lay on the ground. One man died immediately from the blow, the second was killed by a ruptured throat, and the third was unconscious and soon died from internal injuries. While examining the site of the attack, the colonists discovered another detail that made them finally abandon the idea that it was an ordinary animal. Thomas Embry's face lay on the ground next to the gate. It had been peeled almost completely off, along with his hair and part of his neck, as if someone had carefully removed it with a knife. The inside of the skin remained moist and warm. The diary's author writes that several men refused to touch this discovery. However, one of the senior colonists lifted it with a stick and examined it carefully. There were no teeth marks or jagged edges inside. The skin had been separated smoothly, as if by a surgical incision. At that moment, one of the guards reported hearing voices from the forest again. The men climbed the wall and saw dark silhouettes flickering at the edge of the trees. They did not come closer, but stood between the trunks of the pine trees and sometimes made quiet sounds. Several times Thomas Embry's name came out of the darkness again, spoken by the same voice the colonists had heard on previous nights. Only now did everyone understand that this voice belonged to the creature that had worn his face a few minutes ago. I've reached the point in the manuscript where the fear inside the fort for the first time ceases to be fear of the unknown and takes the form of a specific species, specific behavior, specific biology. After the night at the northern gate, the colonists no longer argued about whether they heard wolves, Indians, or the echo of their own imagination. Before them stood an animal capable of wearing human skin as an outer covering, maintaining balance on its two hind limbs, and reproducing human speech with such accuracy that armed adults opened the gates for it. It is after this that the word Croatoan appears in the records, but not as a direction or as the name of a refuge. It appears as a warning that the locals knew long before the British arrived. The diary's author writes about this not from guesswork, but from several brief contacts with those Indians who still came out to the colony at the beginning of winter to exchange fish, dried meat, and information about the coast. Before the attack at the gate, talk of forest voices seemed like ordinary native superstition to the settlers. After the attack, these words were reinterpreted as a description of a known threat. It turned out that the island and the surrounding areas of the mainland had seasonal rather than permanent value for the tribe. During certain months, the Croatoan people abandoned the area entirely, taking their children, elderly people, and food supplies south to safer camps. The British mistook this for a migration for economic reasons. Now it's clear that it was a regular departure from the predators' breeding grounds. One detail in the records is particularly significant. The Indians didn't describe the threat as spirits or witchcraft. They spoke of it as an ordinary part of local life, just one that couldn't be negotiated with. The diary's author notes that their words echoed signs consistent with the attack at the gate. The creatures emerge closer to human habitation at the end of the cold season. Before a direct attack, they spend weeks studying the settlement, memorizing voices, movement patterns, the smell of smoke, the location of doors, and the habits of the guards. They rarely attack during the day and don't waste their energy on assaults. Their hunting method is based on attrition. First, they test which ones can be lured out by crying. Then they try individual names. And finally, they give the colony body a false signal to return. If a settlement is foolish enough to open the gates once, the pack will then rethink its tactics and act like a trained enemy. I compared these notes separately with 3 materials listed in the accompanying documents. The first concerns claw marks on the northern gate and the upper log of the palisade. The indentations are arranged parallel, and the distance between them corresponds to long fingers, not to an animal's paw. The second material refers to a medical description of the so-called killed wolf. Even in later terminology, researchers did not dare to call the carcass a human or a primate, although the structure of the hand, pelvis, and larynx did not fit into the anatomy of canines. The third document is a working note on the properties of the vocal apparatus. It explicitly states that the complex structure of cartilage and cavities in the upper respiratory tract could have acted as an acoustic resonator and allowed for the reproduction of a wide range of sounds, including human speech. For the 16th century, this would have seemed like a diabolical obsession. For any zoologist, it looks like a specialized hunting mechanism. The diary's tone changes after this conclusion. The author no longer asks what they are. He's trying to figure out how many of them are around the fort and why the locals didn't warn the British more directly. The answer is probably simple, and therefore especially unpleasant. The Indians warned. They simply spoke a language the colonists didn't want to consider accurate. When they were told that during the season the forest begins to speak with human voices, the English heard a fairy tale. When they were told that during these months one should not answer a call from the darkness, they heard superstition. When the name Croatoan was spoken with caution, they mistook it for the name of a friendly people, rather than a word associated with the predators themselves. There is a place in the manuscript where the author writes, almost with cold fury, that the error was not in hearing, but in translation. They arrived on an island where the locals had long known the schedule of the strangers' hunt, and still built a fort exactly within its route. After the attack at the gate, the colonists began lighting more torches at night, and completely forbade anyone from leaving the stockade without orders. But by that point, the pack had already gotten what they needed. She checked the gates, saw the order of the guards, heard the cries of the wounded, and learned what the courtyard smelled like after a panic. The shortest and most terrifying entry on these pages does not consist of descriptions of corpses or complaints of fear. The author only notes that by morning, neatly laid out remains of Thomas Embry's clothing were found at the very line of the forest, but there was no human skin nearby. This meant that the predator's first attempt at penetration had been successful, and that the next one would be better prepared. After the night at the northern gate, life inside the fort changed immediately. The diary's author writes that people have stopped perceiving the forest as an ordinary part of the surrounding world. The tree line now became the boundary beyond which the enemy lurked, having already explored the colony and begun an active hunt. The first decision made by the senior settlers concerned the guard regime. Night guards were doubled, and loaded arquebuses were constantly kept on the towers. Torches burned constantly at the gates, ensuring that no movement near the palisade was left in the dark. However, after just a few nights, it became clear that the creatures had no intention of repeating their previous mistake. Recordings show that after the initial attack, the creatures no longer approached the walls directly. Instead, they took up positions in the woods, about 50 or 60 paces from the fort. In the darkness between the tree trunks, silhouettes could occasionally be seen, moving slowly and almost silently. The colonists fired at these figures, but not a single shot produced any obvious effect. After each volley, silence fell in the forest, and then the voices would reappear. These voices gradually became the pack's main weapon. The diary's author describes how they almost always began the same way. At first, a child's cry was heard, short and intermittent, like that of a child who was cold or lost. After a few minutes, the crying turned to quiet words. Sometimes it was a woman's voice, sometimes a man's, but he almost always uttered familiar names. The creatures clearly remembered the speech of the people inside the fort and used it for hunting. One of the entries describes a night when 3 different voices simultaneously came from the forest. One called the name of a woman who lived in the southern part of the settlement. The second voice repeated the name of an old fisherman who had lost his son while sailing across the ocean. The third voice recited the words of the prayer the colonists recited in the chapel that evening. The author notes that all 3 sounds sounded so close and so natural that several people instinctively approached the gate, despite the ban. From that moment on, fatigue began to undermine discipline. People almost stopped sleeping. Guards stood all night, and during the day they had to work to maintain fortifications and forage for food. After a few days, many began to complain of auditory deceptions. Some claimed to hear voices even when others noticed nothing. The diary's author records an incident in which one of the settlers attempted to climb over the wall at night, claiming that his own daughter was calling him in the forest. The girl had to be forcibly held inside the house to prevent her from hearing her name being called from the darkness. Meanwhile, the creatures themselves remained nearly invisible. Only occasionally did the guards notice movement among the trees. The silhouettes appeared disproportionately long and sometimes they seemed to stand upright, like people. But as soon as a torch was pointed at them or an arquebus fired, the figures disappeared. The author concludes that the creatures have excellent vision in the dark and deliberately stay outside the illuminated area. A few weeks after the first attack, the colonists began finding strange traces near the fort walls. In the mornings, small objects were found lying near the stockade. Sometimes these were pieces of cloth, sometimes human bones, stripped of flesh. One account says that one morning, a human hand was found at the gate. The skin was missing, and the fingers were neatly straightened, as if they were being prepared for some further use. The diary's author notes that there was no blood or signs of a struggle near this discovery. The most disturbing detail appears in an entry made several days later. One of the guards claimed to have seen a figure in the forest, dressed in the cloak of one of the dead colonists. The figure stood among the trees and moved slowly, as if trying to walk on two legs. As the guard raised his musket, the man turned his head and called out his name in the same voice previously heard, only in the darkness. Then the figure disappeared among the pines. The diary author concludes this section of the entry with a brief conclusion. He writes that the pack is not attempting to storm the fort by force. The creatures are learning. Each night brings them new words, new moves, and new ways to approach people. And if the first attempt at penetration was crude, the next one, he believes, will be much more precise. I carefully compared the diary entries with the geography of the island and with the information that has survived about the Croatoan tribe. At a certain stage of the siege, the author of the text begins to describe not only the events inside the fort, but also the reasons why the colony found itself in such a situation in the first place. These pages are particularly important because it is here that the explanation for the inscription carved into the wood on the north wall appears. Until this time, the settlers considered it to be an indication of the direction to the neighbouring island. But the person who kept the records after Governor White directly states the opposite. He writes that the word Croatoan in this case does not mean a place or allies, but the name of what comes from the forest. This idea came to him after a conversation with two Indians who had come to the fort in the fall to exchange fish and dried meat. The author notes that at the time, the colonists dismissed their words as mere native superstition. However, now those same words began to form a clear picture. The Native Americans said the forest in these parts wasn't always human. At certain times of the year, creatures appeared, which they called by the same word they later carved into the tree. The Croatoan people had known about them for a long time, and therefore never remained on the island at the end of the cold season. They moved south with their children and food supplies, leaving the lands empty until the danger had passed. The diary's author emphasizes that the Native Americans did not describe the creatures as spirits or demons. They spoke of them as animals, albeit unusual ones. According to them, this is a pack of predators capable of walking on their hind legs and making human sounds. Their main weapon is not strength, but the ability to deceive the ear. First, they observe people and memorize their voices. Then they begin to use these voices to lure prey out of hiding. If the prey resists, the pack continues to wait and learn. The diary notes that the Indians warned the colonists not to remain on the island during what they called the time of voices. However, the English did not take this warning seriously. To them, stories about animals speaking in human words seemed like ordinary legends. Now, after a night at the gate and subsequent screams from the forest, the author of the recording admits that the colony ended up right in the middle of territory that local residents had long considered dangerous. One detail is particularly disturbing. The Native Americans claimed that the creatures don't always attack immediately. Sometimes they can remain near a settlement for weeks, studying it. They memorize where the gates are, how many people are on guard duty, and which names are heard most often. Only then does the pack begin to act. The diary's author concludes that the first night cries heard by the colonists in winter could have been precisely this stage of observation. Comparing this information with what happened at the northern gate, he comes to another conclusion. The attack by the creature wearing Thomas Embry's skin was not a random attack by a single beast. It was a trial run. The creature allowed people to see it and even shoot at it to test their reactions and behavior. After this, the flock changed tactics and stopped approaching the walls directly. This idea is confirmed by further observations. The diary states that after that night, the cries from the forest became more complex. Sometimes the voices conversed with each other, repeating short phrases the colonists had heard inside the fort during the day. Sometimes words could be heard from the darkness, spoken by the same voices that belonged to people who had already died. With each passing day, it became clear that the creatures weren't simply copying sounds. They learned to use them wisely. The author concludes this section of the entry with a brief remark. He writes that by midwinter, most people inside the fort had ceased to doubt the Indians' words. The colonists realized that they had entered the territory of a predator who was in no hurry to attack because he was confident in the outcome of the hunt. And the inscription on the tree near the northern wall became the only warning for those who might one day come to this island after them. I continued reading the manuscript, and it gradually became clear that the events around the fort had turned into a real siege, although none of the creatures were trying to climb over the palisade anymore. After the night at the northern gate, the creatures' behavior completely changed. They stopped approaching the walls and stayed in the darkness of the forest, a few dozen steps away from the fortifications. The guards occasionally noticed movement between the pine trunks, but each time the figures disappeared before they could be seen. Sometimes eyes reflected in the fire would flash in the darkness, but most often only their voices betrayed the pack's presence. The nights grew long and heavy. At first, the sound of a child's cry could be heard from the forest. It began quietly, as if a baby was frozen and no longer had the strength to cry. After a few minutes, the crying turned into human words. Sometimes it was a woman's voice, sometimes a man's. He asked for help, called out familiar names, and repeated phrases that the colonists had spoken during the day inside the fort. Several times, words of prayer echoed from the darkness, almost word for word the same as those recited in the chapel that evening. The beings acted patiently. They didn't rush to the gates or try to break the logs. Instead, they stood among the trees for hours and continued talking. The voices sounded so close that it seemed as if the person was right behind the wall. Several times the guards swore that they heard footsteps right at the palisade. But when the torches illuminated the ground, they did not find a single fresh footprint there. After a few weeks, fatigue began to destroy order within the fort. People almost stopped sleeping. During the day, they had to repair houses, dry meat, and monitor supplies. And at night, the guards listened to cries from the forest. Some colonists began to hear voices, even when others noticed nothing. One man claimed his dead mother was calling him. Another tried to climb over the wall several times, insisting his child was crying in the forest. The hardest night was when a human figure first appeared from the darkness. First, a child's cry was heard again. Then a female voice said that a wounded man was lying near the fort, bleeding. After that, a body actually appeared in the darkness. It lay on the ground, right at the line of light the torches reached. At first, it looked like a man was trying to crawl toward the gate, slowly pulling himself up with his arms. Several men on the wall decided that it might be one of the hunters who had somehow ended up outside the fort. One of the guards had already gone down and grabbed the bolt, intending to open the gate. He was stopped literally at the last moment. It was decided to wait until dawn and not take any risks. The figure on the ground remained motionless for almost an hour. At times, it seemed to move feebly, as if a wounded man were trying to rise. But then a movement occurred that shattered this impression. The body slowly straightened and rose to its feet. The silhouette proved too long for a human figure. It took a few steps back, turned, and disappeared among the trees. In the morning, the men examined the ground near the wall. There were indeed footprints there, but none of them resembled human ones. The damp soil preserved long, widely spaced hind paw prints, as if the creature had taken long strides. Nearby, dents were visible where a body had lain on the ground, mimicking a wounded person. After that night, it became clear that the creatures weren't simply imitating voices. They observed people and gradually learned their behavior. The voices began to use not only the names of living colonists, but also the voices of those who had already died. Sometimes Thomas Embry's speech would echo from the forest. Sometimes the words of the men killed at the gates would be heard. All this was repeated over and over again, every night, without interruption. The walls of the fort remained intact, but the pressure on the people inside grew stronger every day, because the enemy did not try to break through by force. He patiently waited for one of the exhausted humans to open the gates themselves. The night when the colonists first managed to wound one of the creatures is described in particular detail in the diary. By that time, the people inside the fort had already stopped reacting to every sound from the forest. Otherwise, no one would have been able to stand the endless shouts and imitations. The guards tried to listen calmly and shoot only when they saw movement. It was thanks to this that one of the night shifts spotted a silhouette in the darkness, moving closer to the wall than usual. The figure moved slowly and was barely concealed. It stood between two pine trees, about 40 paces from the palisade. The guard on the tower pointed a torch there, and for a brief moment the light touched the body. It became clear that the creature was standing on its hind legs, holding its forelimbs tucked into its chest, as if trying to maintain balance. At that moment, one of the colonists fired an arquebus. The gunpowder flashed, and the bullet struck the target almost squarely in the shoulder. The creature reacted sharply. It dropped to its forelimbs and attempted to disappear into the forest, but a second shot caught it as it ran. After that, a short, wheezing sound was heard in the darkness. The people on the wall didn't come out immediately. They waited until dawn and only then opened the gates to check the impact site. The body lay at the edge of the forest, partially hidden among the roots of pine trees. At first glance, it did resemble a large wolf. However, as the colonists approached, the resemblance disappeared. The beast was significantly taller than any wolf they had ever seen. Even lying on its side, its body reached chest level with a human. The forelimbs were long and ended in fingers rather than paws. Each finger consisted of several phalanges and ended in a curved claw, similar to those of large primates. The head looked even stranger. The muzzle was indeed elongated, but the lower jaw could open much wider than that of a normal animal. When one of the men carefully lifted the head with a stick, the complex structure of the larynx became visible. Cartilaginous rings formed an expanded cavity, reminiscent of a resonator. One of the colonists suggested that this device was what allowed the creature to reproduce human sounds. Other signs of unusual anatomy were also discovered on the body. The pelvic bones were positioned at an angle that allowed the animal to stand confidently on its hind limbs. The thigh muscles were more developed than those of wolves, and the joints allowed for long steps and high jumps. The colonists immediately remembered how the creature that had entered the fort on the night of Embry's death had jumped over the top of the palisade. Particular attention was drawn to the remnants of human skin still clinging to the neck of the slain animal. The skin had been removed almost entirely from the head and shoulders of a man. The interior surface had been carefully cleared of excess tissue, as if it were being prepared to be placed on the body of another creature. The diary's author writes that this fact horrified the people more than the creature's anatomy itself. While the colonists were examining the body, voices began to come from the forest again. This time, they sounded different. They began to produce something similar to short, abrupt sounds, reminiscent of barking or growling, but mixed with human words. The people froze for a moment, because amidst all the sounds, the voice of one of the men standing by the corpse suddenly rang out clearly. He uttered just 2 words. He gave the order to return to the gate. At that moment, it became clear that the pack was watching them from the forest and had already begun using the new words they had heard just minutes earlier. The body of the slain creature was left inside the fort. The men made this decision not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. Until that moment, they knew of the enemy only from tracks, voices, and a brief flash of fighting at the gates. Now a real body lay before them, and the colonists tried to figure out what exactly they were dealing with. The corpse was moved to an empty storage room by the eastern wall, where tools were usually stored. The door was closed, and a guard was posted nearby, as no one was sure how the remaining creatures would react. Upon examination, it became clear that the creature had not died instantly. The bullet entered his shoulder and passed through his chest, puncturing a lung. His blood was thick and dark, almost black in the dim torchlight. The fur on his sides was soaked with it and matted into hard clumps. One of the men, who had previously served as a surgeon's assistant on the ship, carefully cut the skin with a knife to examine the structure of the muscles and bones. The diary entry conveys this observation in great detail. Dense muscles were revealed beneath the fur, particularly in the hips and back. These muscles allowed the animal to spring upright and leap to heights inaccessible to ordinary animals. The forelimb bones were longer than expected. The shoulder joint allowed the arm to rotate almost like a human's, which explained the creature's ability to grasp and hold prey. The fingers were long and flexible, and the claws grew directly from the last phalanx, like a natural extension of the bone. The strangest part of the body was the larynx. When the skin on the neck was parted, a complex network of cartilages and cavities became visible. One of these cavities resembled a small sac connected to the airway. When the chest was pressed, air passed through this sac, and a short sound similar to a human word came out of the mouth. The people in the room fell silent for a moment, as the sound sounded too much like speech. The creature's head was no less disturbing. The skull was elongated, but the eyes were positioned closer to the front than those of wolves. This allowed them to look almost straight ahead, like humans. The jaws opened wide, and the teeth were thin and sharp, designed more for cutting meat than crushing bones. A long tongue covered in rough papillae was found inside the mouth. One of the colonists suggested that it was language that allowed the creatures to accurately reproduce the sounds of human speech. While the colonists were busy examining the creatures, the remaining creatures began to gather around the fort again. This became clear from the voices that gradually appeared behind the walls. This time, they sounded more tense. Occasionally, short cries, like signals, came from the darkness. Several times, the guards heard human words spoken almost in whispers. Towards midnight, new objects began to appear near the palisade. At first, they were pieces of cloth. Then they began throwing the mutilated remains of animals and people against the walls. Some bodies were missing heads or limbs, but one detail was repeated every time. The victim's clothing was stripped of everything that could be removed. Cloaks, shirts, waistcoats, and hats disappeared. The bodies were left naked. The colonists quickly realized the significance of these finds. The creatures weren't simply killing. They collected clothing and human skins, just as they had earlier skinned Thomas Embry's face. The diarist writes that after this, a new feeling arose within the fort, one more oppressive than fear. People began to realize that the pack was preparing for something more than random attacks at the gates. The enemy was learning to speak in more than just human voices. He gradually collected everything that allowed him to look human. After mutilated bodies and scraps of clothing began to be thrown under the walls of the fort, it became clear within the colony that the pack had changed its hunting method. Previously, the creatures had tried to lure people out of the fortification with their voices. Now they began preparing for the opposite. They collected everything that would allow them to approach the gate so that the guards on the wall would see in front of them not animals, but human figures. The first signs of this new tactic appeared a few nights after the slain creature was examined. The guards on the towers noticed movement in the forest that was different from the previous silhouettes. Sometimes figures resembling people in long cloaks flashed between the trees. They moved slowly and didn't approach the walls, but with each appearance they looked increasingly like human bodies. At first, the colonists thought it might be an optical illusion. The nights grew heavy, people barely slept, and many complained of strange shadows in the darkness. However, the sightings soon recurred. Several guards independently reported seeing the figure of a man in a hat standing at the edge of the forest. When the torches illuminated the clearing, the silhouette disappeared, as if retreating between the trees. A few days later, one of these figures approached. It stopped about 50 paces from the palisade and stood motionless for a long time. She was indeed wearing a long cloak, similar to those worn by the colonists themselves. At one point, the figure slowly raised its hand and made a gesture resembling a signal. One of the guards almost responded with the same gesture because it was familiar. It was how they called people to the gate when they returned from hunting. Only a few seconds later did the men on the wall notice that the figure's arms were too long and its shoulders were at an odd angle. The guard raised his musket and fired. The silhouette jerked sharply and instantly disappeared into the darkness. Only a few scraps of fabric were found on the ground near the edge of the forest, which were later identified as part of the waistcoat of one of the dead settlers. Every day the number of such figures grew. Sometimes 2 or 3 were seen at once. They walked between the trees on 2 legs, but they didn't move like people. The steps were too long and the body sometimes leaned forward, as if the body had become accustomed to a different form of movement. However, in the darkness, these details were difficult to notice. The voices, too, had changed. Now, short commands, similar to the words the colonists themselves used while on guard duty, occasionally came from the forest. The creatures repeated them almost flawlessly. Several times the guards heard familiar signals that were usually used to warn of the approach of a boat or a group of people. One night, words came from the darkness, signaling that a detachment was approaching the fort from the sea. This was the first moment of hope within the colony. Some people assumed the governor's ship had finally returned and his men had landed. However, those manning the towers quickly noticed a discrepancy. The voices came from the forest, not from the water. And most importantly, figures were moving among the trees, dressed in cloaks and hats that had once belonged to the fallen colonists. It then became clear that the pack was preparing for the final stage of the hunt. The creatures had already learned to imitate human voices and were now attempting to imitate human appearance. They collected clothes, pulled on the skins of the killed people, and walked around the fort on their hind legs, gradually approaching the gate. The people inside the fort began to realize that the following night could be decisive. If just one person believed what they saw at the gate and opened the bolt, the pack would no longer need to wait in the forest. A moonless night arrived after 2 days of damp winds blowing in from the strait. By dusk, the sky had become so thick that even the tops of the pine trees had vanished into the black mass before the first torches at the gate had burned out. At such hours, the fort lost its usual outlines. The palisade turned into a dark wall. The towers hung over the courtyard like empty frames, and people could distinguish each other only by coughing, the creaking of shoes, and the smell of wet wool. It was on this night that the creatures first approached so close that even a sober sentry could have been mistaken. At first, from the forest came not screams or cries, but the familiar sound of a military formation. One could hear the heavy steps of several people walking on the damp ground, the occasional clang of iron on wood, and the muffled voices of men who seemed to be speaking in low voices, trying not to raise the alarm prematurely. The sound came not from the water, but from the northern edge of the forest, but this wasn't immediately noticed. After weeks of sleep deprivation and endless imitations, the people inside the fort no longer trusted their hearing, memory, or even their own eyes. When words came from the darkness about returning with supplies and the order to open the gates for their own, several people in the courtyard actually decided that help had finally arrived on the island. I reread this passage especially carefully because it's not the tone that changes in the notes, but the very density of observation. What's being described isn't a feeling of horror, but a sequence of details. There were at least 6 figures standing at the gate. They walked on 2 legs, formed an uneven line, like tired men after landing, and were dressed in the long cloaks, hats, and waistcoats that had belonged to the dead colonists. The torches didn't quite reach their faces, so the first impression was the most dangerous. It seemed the English had approached the fort after a long journey along the coast. One of the silhouettes even raised his hand, as sailors did, demanding that the door be opened immediately and that no time be wasted on questions. But as the figures entered the band of flickering light, the lie began to unravel at the seams. The nearest man's hat brim sat too low, almost at eye level, as if the head underneath it was stretched up and forward. The cloak on his back didn't lie flat against the fabric, but stretched across his shoulder blades in sharp angles. The sleeves seemed short because they revealed hands with abnormally long fingers. One of the silhouettes stopped sideways, and then, for a moment, it became clear that its knees were bending in a different plane than a human's. It was hidden when walking, but when motionless, the error was glaring. The worst part was the skin. Several faces looked human only from a distance. By the fire, it became clear that it was pulled too tight at the temples and too loose at the chin. On one creature, the cheek had peeled off and slid down, revealing grey fur beneath the slit. The other held its head down, so that the wrinkle of the alien face hung from its muzzle like a wet rag. But even in this state, they continued to speak in the correct voices. One called out the name of the man on the tower. Another called out the name of the carpenter standing by the bolts. A third hoarsely announced that the boats were wrecked, the men were injured, and there was no time to check. A movement began in the courtyard. Those not standing on the wall couldn't see the clearing as clearly, and heard only familiar voices. Several women emerged from their houses. 2 men dragged a spare lantern to the gate. Someone said that living people couldn't stay out in the rain for so long, and that they couldn't leave their own people outside until morning. This was immediately countered by saying that the voices were coming from the forest, and that help wouldn't have come from land. The argument wasn't loud, but it carried that weariness that makes a person willing to believe any version, just so long as it ends the night. The creatures understood this. They stopped standing motionless and took a few more steps forward, no longer hiding. Now they were almost entirely visible. Cloaks hid their torsos, hats covered the tops of their heads, and the victims' faces, stripped from their skulls along with their hair, were pulled tight like crude masks. The hem of one of the waistcoats came apart, and underneath it, a hind leg with a long shin and a twisted joint flashed. But it was at that moment that the nearest creature spoke in the voice of the murdered Thomas Embry, saying that the governor's men were standing on the shore and that if the gates were not open now, then half of the wounded would bleed to death by dawn. Then, from the darkness behind the leading figures, more voices came. They began speaking at once, like a small group irritated by the delay at the gate. On the tower, one guard had already moved towards the stairs to go down. Below, 2 men grabbed the bolt and immediately released it, because the tallest figure emerged from the line of false saviors and stepped straight into the light. The wide cloak opened, and there was no human body underneath. There moved a narrow chest covered with grey fur. Long forelimbs were pressed to the stomach, and on the neck hung a whole human chest with a piece of skin worn like an apron. The creature stopped, bowed its head, and, in its own low, almost dry voice, repeated the same order to open the gate. After this, the remaining figures also stepped forward, and it became clear that no rescue had come to the fort. A pack that had learned to carry people from the outside approached the walls. After the night at the gate, when the pack first approached the stockade in the clothes of the dead people, the last thing that still held the colony in order disappeared inside the fort. Until then, the settlers had lived in fear, but fear still left room for calculation. Now, the calculation was over. People had been sleepless for so many nights in a row that they couldn't tell the difference between hearing errors and real movement near the wall. The voices from the forest never stopped, not even for an hour. Even during the day, some people thought that behind the houses someone was calling them by name, whispering prayers, or crying in a child's voice at the well. Several people began to say that a slow death from lack of sleep and hunger was worse than going out of the gate with a weapon. Others demanded that the bolt be kept closed until the end, because any conversation with the darkness was already a lost cause. By the evening of the next day, the argument had degenerated into open hostility. Almost every man capable of wielding a musket had gathered at the northern wall. Some demanded to march in formation and comb the forest edge to the swamp, hoping to disperse the pack with fire and lead. Others recalled that the creatures never fought fairly and always struck where humans made the first mistake. The women and children remained in their homes, but even from there, the noise could be heard. Several times, the voices of those who were no longer alive were heard again in the darkness. They sounded so close, as if the speakers were standing on the other side of the logs, their palms brushing the damp wood. Around midnight, it began to rain. It was fine, cold, almost misty, and the torches at the gate burned poorly, giving off a frayed, weak light. It's in weather like this that the eye is especially likely to mistake wishful thinking for reality. Footsteps came from the forest again. This time, there were more of them than the previous night. The movement of an entire group could be heard, as if a detachment of people were walking towards the fort without formation, tired after a long journey. Then a voice was heard calling the name of Governor White and announcing that boats had arrived from the sea and that men had been sent to the gates with orders to open them immediately. Almost immediately, another voice added that they were wounded on the shore and that hesitation was killing one's own. That was enough. One of the colonists, who had hardly slept for several weeks and by then had lost his wife during a night foray for water, was the first to approach the bolt. They tried to stop him, but he began to shout that things couldn't get any worse and that if there really were White's people behind the gates, then the fort was finishing itself off with cowardice. Another man joined him, then a third. Those who still had their wits about them rushed to the gate, trying to hold the heavy beam in place. A crush began in the narrow space around the doors. People bumped shoulders, someone fell, someone dropped a torch, and the light in the courtyard immediately dimmed. Outside, the conversation continued. The voices no longer pleaded, they urged. They repeated the familiar commands that the guards themselves used when the hunters returned, and this made the whole scene even more dangerous. At one point, one of the men inside the fort shouted that he recognized his own brother's voice. He then grabbed the bolt with such force that he tore it from his neighbor's hands. The wooden beam slipped from its mountings. The doors still held, but only by the pressure of the people inside. What happened next was quick and almost silent. The gate opened to the width of a shoulder, and into this gap immediately entered a long grey limb, with fingers similar to human ones, only too thin and long. She caught hold of the edge of the door and yanked the wood toward herself. The hinges groaned. The people standing closest managed to see in front of them, not people in cloaks, but elongated muzzles under sagging skin, wet fur on the chest, and the empty eye sockets of alien faces stretched over skulls. Then the line of creatures burst inside. Not a single one of them growled. That was the main horror. They acted like a trained pack, one that had seen the soft spots of the human body many times before. The first three at the gate were killed almost immediately. One had his throat ripped out with an upward motion. The other had his stomach pierced with claws and was tossed aside so he wouldn't interfere with the passage. The third was knocked down and his cloak was immediately torn off, as if clothing held any special value for the attackers. More followed the first wave. They moved on their hind legs, but in the cramped courtyard, they sometimes dropped to their forelimbs, which made them even faster. I reread the description of how the fort fell from the inside several times. The humans weren't defeated by the assault. They themselves opened a direct path for the enemy, and the pack merely seized the moment they had been preparing for weeks. Some of them remained at the gate, holding the passage open, while the rest began to disperse across the courtyard in short dashes, as if they knew in advance the location of the houses, warehouse, and powder magazine. This meant that by that night they had studied the fort better than many of its inhabitants. When the gates were torn down and the first wave of the pack entered the courtyard, resistance disintegrated almost immediately. Those closest to the entrance died in the first seconds. The rest rushed toward the houses, the warehouse, the chapel, wherever wood and thin doors could, at least for a moment, replace a wall. It didn't help. The creatures did not rush around the camp in search of prey and did not attack randomly. They moved around the fort as if they knew in advance where the women would sleep, where the children were kept, where the tools were stored, and where the gunpowder was kept. It's this detail that stands out most in the final pages of the manuscript. The enemy didn't simply break through. He entered a space he had already mastered. There were no screams in the courtyard, the usual sounds of a massacre. Those the pack killed first often didn't have time to scream at all. The creatures struck at the throat, under the lower jaw, in the soft part of the abdomen, and then immediately retreated to the next target. Several bodies were later found against a wall with the carotid artery neatly severed. There was a lot of blood around, but there were almost no signs of a struggle. People weren't torn apart in rage, they were quickly incapacitated, after which part of the pack began dragging the bodies toward the center of the courtyard. It wasn't a hunt in the traditional sense, but rather a gathering of material. The description of what happened to the dead immediately after the murder is particularly terrifying. The creatures were stripped of their cloaks, cut sleeves, alien hats, and wet pieces of skin worn on their heads and shoulders. But as soon as another person fell, one or two animals immediately moved to the body and began stripping it of its clothes. They worked quickly and deftly. Vests were ripped open at the seams with claws, shirts were pulled off entirely, and shoes were pulled off by holding the shin. On some bodies, neat circular cuts were later found at the hairline and wrists. This meant that the pack, even as the attack was underway, was still harvesting skins for further masks. In this general carnage, not a single person ran to the house or attempted to break through to the gate. The deputy governor, the very one in whose hand the final pages were written, immediately realized that it was no longer possible to hold the fort. He saw how the creatures were dispersing across the yard, and how some of them, without stopping near the bodies, were heading straight to where the powder magazine stood. It was a low, partially buried building with thick walls, where the main supplies of dry gunpowder and some of the lead were kept. He reached there, locked the heavy door with the inner bar, and began writing in the darkness, using the remnants of a candle and the embers from the wick. These lines show that inside the cellar, he first understood the most important thing. The pack didn't act like a gathering of blood-fueled beasts. It assigned roles. Some held the gates, others combed the houses, still others tended to the bodies. And from the sounds outside, it was clear they were exchanging short signals. These weren't just screams or mindless barking. The noise had a rhythm and was repetitive. After each such signal, the movement in the courtyard changed. If a human screech was heard somewhere, 2 or 3 people would immediately rush there. If a door fell, others would flock to it. Deputy White recorded that the creatures learn not only voices, but also order. They memorize how humans live together and then use this knowledge against them. From the cellar, he heard footsteps at the entrance, the scraping of claws on wood, and someone outside trying to command him to open the door in a human voice. At first, the voice was male and confident. Then it gave way to a child's cry. Then a woman spoke from behind the door, calling him by name and informing him that there were survivors in the courtyard. There was silence for a few seconds after that, and into that silence broke a dry, low sound, no longer resembling human. This was probably how the creatures spoke to each other when they weren't imitating their prey. He didn't open it. Instead, he continued writing, and judging by the marks on the paper, he was simultaneously preparing everything he needed for one final act. The entries contain a short list of what was left inside. Several barrels of gunpowder, a bundle of fuses, a box of bullets, a knife, a candle, a diary, and a lead cylinder that the governor had once buried. At that point, no one was looking outside for anyone who might be hiding in the houses. The creatures gathered at the cellar. They realized that a man was inside who could still deprive them of their prey. Deep claw marks began to appear on the door, and then narrow cracks opened in the boards one after another. Through them, the night air, the smell of wet fur and fresh blood wafted in. The last line on this page tells only one thing. He finished writing, sealed the diary in lead, and heard the top hinge of the door crack. The last pages of the manuscript are written much more unevenly than the previous ones. The ink has run in places and several lines are written at an angle, as if the person had written them while holding the paper with one hand and listening to sounds outside the door. From this point on, the recording turns from a description of what is happening in the courtyard to a coherent account of what he is doing inside the powder magazine and why. Outside, human voices are no longer audible. The imitations the pack used all winter are no longer needed. Only short, dry sounds, reminiscent of clicks and soft barks, can be heard from behind the door. Judging by the diary entries, these signals sound in a pattern. After each one, the knocks on the door become louder or, conversely, stop for a few seconds. The man inside the cellar writes that by this point he had already understood the main principle of the creature's behavior. They are capable of learning very quickly. Every night spent with people gave them new words, new movements, and new ways of deceiving. If even one of the creatures survives this siege, after a while it will be able to reproduce human speech even more accurately and use human clothing and skin even more confidently. That is why he decides that leaving the cellar and trying to escape is pointless. Even if he manages to get out through the back wall and reach the shore, the pack will be able to continue hunting anyone who ever swims to this island. Before he gets to the gunpowder, he does one more thing. He exits the cellar through a narrow passage that connects the warehouse to the back of the yard. This hole was designed to carry out heavy barrels without opening the main door. At night, one could escape through it unnoticed. He writes that there's almost no movement in the courtyard anymore. Most of the pack is concentrated at the entrance to the cellar. Several creatures stand near the center of the camp where the bodies lie. In the dim light of the smoldering torches, they can be seen continuing to strip the clothing and skin from the dead. Taking advantage of the darkness, he moves along the wall to an old oak tree on the north side of the palisade. This is the same tree under whose roots the lead cylinder was later found. With a knife, he carves into the bark a word he once heard from the Indians. He writes that it is neither a direction nor the name of an island. It's a warning about who lives in these woods. The letters are deep because he stabs them almost blindly, trying to finish the job as quickly as possible. Afterward, he returns to the cellar. Inside are barrels of dry gunpowder, wrapped in thick cloth. He cuts open several sacks and pours the gunpowder onto the floor, connecting the bulk of the powder to the fuse with a path. The entry indicates that the wick was wrapped around an iron nail to keep the fire burning slowly, giving time to finish the entry. The final lines were written in the dim light of a nearly burnt-out candle. By this point, the noise outside the door has become very loud. The creatures have realized that something important is happening inside. The sound of claws and teeth striking the wood intensifies. Long fingers poke through cracks in the boards. Several times, human speech comes from the cracks. One voice tries to order the door to be opened. Another speaks in the words of a child. But there's already a sense of haste in these sounds. The pack smells gunpowder. The final entry in the diary is very brief. It says that if the ship ever approaches Roanoke Island again, people should read the inscription on the tree and not look for a colony there. After this line, the handwriting abruptly ends. The candle had apparently already gone out. The archaeological report I was able to see ends with a technical description of the damage to the fort's foundation. Traces of a powerful explosion and charred remains of wood were discovered in the soil beneath the northern part of the camp. The radius of destruction is consistent with the detonation of several barrels of gunpowder. Only one intact item was found among the rubble. A lead cylinder containing a diary, which had lain beneath the oak tree's roots and survived the explosion, along with the warning carved into its bark.